Darkness can fall upon a life long before a person understands the meaning of loss. And few stories capture this truth as powerfully as the life of Mephibosheth, whose destiny was shaken before he even learned to speak. His name is rarely mentioned, his story often overlooked, yet hidden within it is a depth of struggle and redemption that strikes at the heart of anyone who has ever felt forgotten by the world. Before we unfold the details of his extraordinary journey, tell me in the comments from which country you are watching this video, and if you value lessons drawn from ancient history and faith, consider subscribing to stay connected to more inspiring stories. The tale begins in the shadows of a collapsing kingdom, where a child born into royalty found himself surrounded not by celebration, but by the heavy weight of a legacy unraveling before his eyes. Mephibosheth entered the world as the grandson of Saul, the first king of Israel, and the son of Jonathan, a man known for his courage, loyalty, and unwavering commitment to righteousness. His early life should have been marked by honor, protection, and a future paved with certainty. But instead, every blessing that should have been his was overshadowed by the mounting tensions between Saul and David, the rising warrior chosen by God to lead the nation. The kingdom trembled with internal conflict, the kind that grows quietly at first, then suddenly bursts through the walls of stability and sends shockwaves through every corner of society. And in the midst of this storm, the young prince was caught between loyalty to a family falling from power and the divine destiny moving toward David. The weight of ancient promises, broken oaths, and political uncertainty pressed against the world into which he was born, shaping the path he would walk long before his feet ever touched the ground. His lineage made him both loved and feared, protected yet endangered. And through it all, destiny was already preparing a story far greater than the child himself could imagine. The day the news arrived of Saul and Jonathan's deaths changed everything, sending shock and grief tearing through the land like a relentless wind, sweeping away every remnant of security. For Mephibosheth, only 5 years old, this moment shattered the foundation of his identity, stripping away the father and grandfather who should have guided his footsteps into adulthood. With the fall of his family came the collapse of his future, because in the ancient world, the death of a king did not simply end a reign. It triggered the dangerous aftermath of power shifting, loyalties breaking, and rival factions rising to eliminate any remaining heirs who might one day claim a right to the throne. Fear swept through the household where Mephibosheth was being raised, gripping the hearts of the servants who understood the brutal reality far better than the child in their care. In their desperation to protect him from potential threats, his nurse lifted him into her arms and fled with a haste driven by sheer survival. But urgency and fear can twist even a noble act into tragedy. As she ran, she lost her grip, and the young boy fell to the ground with devastating force. That single accident forever changed his body, leaving him crippled in both feet. What made the tragedy even heavier was that it came on the same day he lost much more than his physical strength. He lost his father, his protection, his inheritance, and any sense of safety he might have known. The fall was more than an injury. It symbolized the complete collapse of the royal house to which he belonged, a collapse that stripped him of every privilege once tied to his name. From that moment on, Mephibosheth lived under the shadow of loss, a child carrying wounds, both seen and unseen, with the world around him forced into hiding to preserve what little remained of Saul's family. The place where Mephibosheth was taken, Lo-debar, was far removed from the centers of power and influence, a barren and isolated land whose very name meant no pasture, a place associated with emptiness, wastelands, and silence. It was not the kind of environment one would expect for the grandson of a king, but it was exactly the kind of place people chose when they wanted to disappear, to bury their past, and to escape the dangerous attention of those who might seek to destroy any remnants of a former dynasty. There, surrounded by obscurity and dependence, Mephibosheth grew into adulthood, far from the life he was born to live. The royal palace, once meant to be his world, existed only in distant memory and whispered stories, while his reality became one of survival rather than sovereignty. Living with physical disability in a time when strength was often equated with worth only deepened the sense of separation between who he was and who he could have been. Lo-debar became a symbol of the emotional and spiritual wilderness he inhabited, a place where dreams do not grow and hope is easily choked by hardship. And yet, even in this desolate environment, his life was not beyond the reach of destiny. Unseen by him and unknown to those around him, a promise made years earlier between two men, his father, Jonathan, and David, the rising king, was still alive, waiting patiently for its moment to emerge from the shadows and transform the life of this forgotten prince. What seemed like an ending was, in truth, only the quiet beginning of a redemption story that would one day pull him from obscurity and place him at a table he never expected to see again. Years passed, and the memory of Saul's fallen house faded into the background of Israel's growing prosperity under the reign of David, a king whose leadership brought unity to the tribes and strength to the nation. Yet even in a throne room filled with advisors, warriors, and constant activity, there came a moment when David felt a stirring in his heart, a quiet reminder of a promise made long ago to a friend he had loved more than any brother. Jonathan. The name alone carried weight, evoking memories of loyalty fierce enough to defy political expectation and friendship, strong enough to bridge the divide between two houses destined for conflict. One day, seemingly out of nowhere, David spoke aloud a question that had been resting silently in his spirit. Is there anyone left of the house of Saul to whom I may show kindness for Jonathan's sake? The room must have paused, because this was not the type of question a king usually asked. Kings typically sought to secure their rule by removing rivals, not by honoring them. Yet David was shaped by something deeper than political instinct. He was shaped by covenant, by loyalty that transcended death, and by a sense of divine purpose that compelled him to remember those whom the world had forgotten. His search for anyone from Saul's line was not driven by guilt or obligation, but by devotion to a friendship sealed with sacred promises. That single decision set in motion a chain of events that reached far beyond the palace walls and all the way into the barren landscape of Lo-debar, where Mephibosheth, unaware of the king's intentions, continued living in obscurity. David's willingness to look backward, to honor his past, and to uphold a vow even when no one expected him to, reveals the depth of his character and the power of compassion born from faithfulness. In a world where many rise to greatness, only to forget those who helped them climb, David chose remembrance over convenience, and that choice would soon transform the destiny of a man who had long believed destiny had no room for him. When word reached Mephibosheth that King David's envoys had arrived in Lo-debar requesting his presence, the shock must have struck him like an unexpected storm tearing through a quiet valley. As someone raised in hiding, someone who had lived years believing that the safest life was the quietest life, a summons from the king could only mean danger. The history between the houses of Saul and David was well known, and Mephibosheth understood enough of the world to know how kings often handled individuals connected to previous rival dynasties. Fear likely settled into him with a heaviness he could not shake. What could David possibly want from a crippled man living in exile, a man who did not have armies or influence or any threat left in him? And yet, he had no choice but to go. The journey to Jerusalem would have been long and filled with anxiety, each step of the journey echoing with questions he could not answer. Was he being brought to the king for judgment? Would he be punished for the sins or failures of his grandfather? Would this be the day his life ended? By the time he arrived before David, every fear he had carried must have been weighing on him like a stone. Standing, or rather, bowing before the most powerful man in the nation, he lowered himself as far as he could, calling himself a dead dog, as if to declare he had no worth, no claim, no right to mercy. His words revealed not only humility, but also deep wounds, the internal scars of a life spent expecting rejection. But David's response shattered every expectation Mephibosheth had brought with him. With words gentle enough to break the hardest fear, the king said, "Do not be afraid." Those 4 words must have flowed over Mephibosheth like water in a desert, unexpected and powerful, carrying more comfort than he had known in years. Because what David offered next was not judgment, not condemnation, not punishment, but restoration. He told Mephibosheth that he would return to him all the land that once belonged to Saul, his grandfather, and that he would eat at the king's table continually as though he were one of David's own sons. In an instant, everything Mephibosheth believed about his future changed. Instead of being erased, he was embraced. Instead of being cast aside, he was invited in. Instead of being feared as a political threat, he was honored as an heir of a cherished friend. It was a moment that upended the usual rules of ancient power and revealed the heart of a king who valued loyalty more than vengeance. To receive a seat at the king's table was not merely a symbolic gesture. It was a declaration of belonging, security, and identity. For Mephibosheth, who had spent his life navigating the limitations of his crippled legs, this invitation meant more than a guarantee of food or safety. It rewrote the narrative he had carried in his heart for decades. In a society that often equated physical wholeness with worthiness, David's act proclaimed that a person's value did not rest in strength, status, or outward perfection. It rested in who they were, whose child they were, and how deeply they were loved. Mephibosheth, once a hidden exile, now found himself seated among princes, treated as family, not as an outsider. Each meal he shared at David's table must have reminded him that grace does not erase brokenness, but instead elevates the broken to a place where dignity can flourish again. His continued disability did not disqualify him from the king's favor. In fact, it made the favor all the more profound. It showed that David's kindness was not transactional or strategic, but deeply rooted in compassion and in the honor of his covenant with Jonathan. For Mephibosheth, this new life was not merely a change of circumstances. It was a restoration of identity, a renewal of hope, and a healing of wounds carried since childhood. And each time he sat at that table, surrounded by the warmth of acceptance rather than the coldness of fear, his very presence testified to the extraordinary power of mercy that transcends politics, history, and human weakness. What began as a forgotten life in a barren land had been transformed into a legacy of grace that continues to inspire hearts across generations. Though Mephibosheth's feet remained crippled for the rest of his life, the transformation that unfolded within him at the king's table revealed a truth far deeper than physical ability could measure. For so many years, he had believed that brokenness defined him, that his disability made him an outsider, unworthy of honor or attention. Yet, sitting, day after day, among the sons of David, began quietly reshaping his understanding of who he was. His presence in that place did not depend on his strength or accomplishments, but on the unwavering kindness of a king who saw past weakness into the worth of a soul long overshadowed by fear and misfortune. In the ancient world, physical imperfections often carried heavy social burdens, marking individuals as less capable, less important, or even less favored by God. But David's actions declared something revolutionary, something that stood against the assumptions of the age, that dignity does not come from outward appearance, and that value is not diminished by affliction. With every meal shared, every conversation offered, and every gesture of acceptance extended toward him, Mephibosheth slowly stepped out of the identity forged in Lodabar and into the truth of who he really was. A son of Jonathan, a man remembered, a life cherished, a human being worthy of honor. The table became a symbol of healing, a place where the echoes of his painful past softened and the weight of shame lifted from his spirit. And although his body remained weak, his identity became whole, revealing a profound message for anyone who has ever felt defined by their limitations, that brokenness does not erase purpose, and grace has the power to restore what life has tried to take away. His story reminds us that the world's measure of worth often falls short of the divine measure, and that those who seem forgotten can be elevated to honor by the simple, powerful gift of compassion. The deeper significance of Mephibosheth's restoration can only be understood by looking at the bond between David and Jonathan, a friendship so strong that its loyalty reached beyond death and into the next generation. Jonathan had stood at David's side during some of the darkest and most defining moments of their youth, showing courage when others hesitated, and offering support even when it meant surrendering his own claim to the throne. Their friendship was not political convenience, but a sacred connection rooted in trust, sacrifice, and shared devotion to God. When Jonathan died, David mourned with a depth of sorrow that time could not erase, and the covenant they made together remained etched into his heart long after their battles were over. So when David sought someone from Saul's household to bless, he was not simply honoring a forgotten oath, He was breathing life into the legacy of a friend whose loyalty had shaped his own rise to kingship. Through Mephibosheth, the honor of Jonathan lived on. Each kindness extended toward him was a continuation of the love and devotion Jonathan had once shown to David. The restoration of Saul's land to Mephibosheth was more than political generosity. It was the visible proof that covenant can outlive conflict, and that loyalty can ripple through generations in ways no one could foresee. Even those who observed this transformation must have sensed the divine fingerprints upon it, because it defied the usual patterns of kingdoms and kings. Instead of erasing the lineage of his former rival, David redeemed it. Instead of crushing potential threats, he uplifted them. Instead of allowing old wounds between families to deepen, he chose peace and restoration. Through this, the friendship between David and Jonathan became an example of loyalty that does not fade with time, a reminder that even in a world filled with betrayal and shifting power, genuine commitment can leave a lasting legacy that reaches farther than one lifetime. As Mephibosheth continued to live in the grace extended to him, his life became a story that resonated far beyond his own generation, carrying lessons of hope to anyone who has ever known loss, hardship, or the weight of circumstances beyond their control. His journey began with tragedy, shaped by a fall that left him physically broken and emotionally burdened, but it did not end there. Though he came from a lineage marked by controversy and collapse, he became a living example of how destiny is never fully erased by the pain of the past. Mephibosheth's restoration is powerful because it shows that being oppressed does not mean being abandoned, and that suffering, while heavy, can still lead to a future filled with blessing. His life was not defined by the unfairness he endured or by the betrayal he feared, but by the kindness he received from a king who looked beyond history and saw humanity. The transformation from forgotten exile to honored guest reveals the heart of a God who delights in lifting the lowly and restoring those who seem beyond reach. Mephibosheth, the blessed son of the oppressed, stands as a symbol for all who walk through seasons of isolation or abandonment, reminding us that redemption can find us even in the most barren places, and that hope can rise from stories we thought were finished. His seat at the table was not the end of his pain, but the beginning of a new identity, a new belonging, and a dignity the world could not take from him. And as generations look back on his life, they see not just a crippled prince or a forgotten child of a fallen dynasty, but a testament to the power of grace, a grace that elevates, restores, and writes endings far more beautiful than the beginnings that preceded them. His story teaches that no life is too damaged to be redeemed, no past too broken to be healed, and no person too forgotten to be remembered by the one who weaves purpose through even the darkest chapters. And so his legacy endures, whispering to every weary heart that humility can be lifted, despair can be reversed, and the oppressed can receive blessings beyond measure.